Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Great to see a big crowd. Um, I'm Harold Holzer. I have the honor of serving as director of Roosevelt House, and what could be better than to be meeting in Franklin and Eleanor's home to talk to Errol Lewis about Mario Cuomo. I mean, that's the best. Um, so I'm happy to relinquish my role as on and off interviewer today to a true leader in the field. It's wonderful to have Errol here, and to remind the group that this is, among other parts of our history here, this is the room, this is the house where Franklin Roosevelt managed his two campaigns for governor of New York. Later, he created the New Deal upstairs, but he also first managed his gubernatorial campaign. So to me, it's the perfect place to explore highlights from New York's political and governmental history since, including especially the highlight called Mario Cuomo. For his part, Errol is no stranger to Hunter College, certainly. He served as a Jack Newfield Fellow when we launched that program here in Jack's honor. In journalism, he was the associate editor of the New York Sun at one point. He was a columnist and a member of the editorial board of the Daily News, and was an award-winning radio host before he launched Inside City Hall on New York One, I read, nearly 24 years ago. That is amazing. He also hosts the National Spectrum news discussion show, The Big Deal, and appears frequently on CNN as a contributor and commentator. And when he's not before the cameras, which must be about 12 minutes a day or so, he serves as director of urban reporting programs at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. And yet he has insisted to city and state, I find this a little hard to believe, that he's only twice been recognized on the streets. Both times as Mayor Adams. We don't think that's true, but it's a great line. Because he is undeniably one of the best known and best respected and most recognized commentators in town. He knows government and politics from the inside out, having not only run for office himself, but who has deeply covered those who have run for office for decades. Oh yes, he also went to Harvard and Yale and has a law degree as well. One more recent aspect of Errol's media career, which is really what brings us here this evening, is that he's now the host of You Decide with Errol Lewis, a podcast that's earned a great deal of attention in New York City, particularly, I think, for the three-parter about Mario Cuomo, The Last Liberal, which is what brings us together tonight. So in essence, we're here for an in-person discussion triggered by a podcast, in turn inspired by a great New York life, a life that has continued to engage and fascinate us without pause, especially those who labored in the vineyards in the Mario Cuomo era. Even as media platforms changed, the focus has remained. And we're just going to be a panel of four tonight. There are many more people who could add their views. I see a lot of old friends and colleagues in the audience tonight, and who knows, maybe, hopefully, we can continue this series in the fall. We're going to ask Errol back and go from podcast to in-person to podcast. It can just go on forever. But I do want to acknowledge just a few of my Cuomo-era colleagues. I'm going to try to do this correctly. Some of my friends, like Ethan Riegelhaupt, who is sitting right here. I'm going to torture you all with pictures from the distant past. There's Ethan. Steve Schlesinger, who is here. I see Mike Klein in the back. Chuck Lesnick is supposed to be here. So there's Chuck. Oh, great. Alice McGillian, are you here? Well, you should have been. I know Maria Cuomo Cole is here, and we're happy to see you. And I see Michael Kramer here. I see Ralph Blumenthal here, a lot of great journalists in the house. And is Saladin Anbar here? There he is, the biographer of Mario Cuomo. Welcome all the way from Rutgers, so thank you for coming. I'm not going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to leave that to our host for the evening. But I will ask our panelists to please take the stage, take your seats. Dennis and Marianne and Errol, I'll join you in a second, because I will say that I want to thank Don Pollard for taking all of the pictures. There's a great picture of Don, who's going to be here later in time for drinks. No surprise. And there's Marianne. Marianne, there's your picture up there with the late Drew Zambelli. Is Drew Jr. here? Oh, thank you for coming. And the last picture is going to be some 29-year-old with a lot of hair.
Okay. I want to correct you on one thing because my producer is here. They started Inside City Hall long before I came along. There were many distinguished hosts before I was hired about 13 years ago. I want to thank everybody for being here, and I'm going to ask you to do one thing as we get started. This is going to be an edition of the podcast, You Decide. And so I'm going to do an intro. I'm going to ask you for a little bit of applause. It'll sound great on the podcast. That's for everybody who wasn't here. I'm Errol Lewis. Welcome to this special edition of You Decide, recorded live at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. Thank you, thank you. Okay, before we begin the panel, I wanted to talk briefly about how we got here. New York One's audio documentary, Mario Cuomo, The Last Liberal, was a special edition of my podcast, You Decide. At the beginning of 2023, we were reminded that it was the 40th anniversary of Mario Cuomo being sworn in as the 52nd governor of New York. We then began to put together a 3-part audio series about the governor's career, and it took us the better part of a year. We interviewed many members of his administration, as well as journalists who covered him, and we were hoping to tell his story that included his upbringing, the 1977 mayoral run, his 3 terms as governor, and the ups and downs of his time in office, while also attempting to take a deeper look at why he made, or did not make, in at least one case, many of the decisions that he became justifiably famous for. We also wanted to take a snapshot of a time in New York that feels like many years ago, but of course is not really a lot for those of us in the room. Most of us remember Mario Cuomo. He was our governor for 12 years. It's not ancient history, but the world has changed dramatically since 1994. And then having said that, Mario Cuomo's positions remain relevant today. In fact, some of the convictions that he championed have become more mainstream, like his fierce opposition to the death penalty, his support of legalized abortion, despite the opposition of those of his Catholic faith in many cases, and of course his understanding and compassion for the working class. So I want to point out some of the people who worked on the podcast. Anthony Roman wrote and produced the entire series and worked tirelessly on this project. Bob Hart, the political director from Spectrum News, edited the scripts and provided essential insight and direction. There was additional editing and post-production by James Asciuto. Our Spectrum News public relations director, Chris Chafin, did a wonderful job getting the word out about the series, and many of you helped with that as well. And then finally, the podcast was executive produced by Lindsay Christ of Spectrum News, who's also the reason we are here tonight. From the moment we finished the series, she was determined to have a live event, and it took us 6 months to get it done, but here we are. These things take time. I want to also mention the podcast is a Deadline Club Award finalist for radio or audio feature reporting. They're going to give the results of that award in 2 days. We'll see if we won. And I want to thank everybody who worked on it and those of you who listened to it, those of you who took our calls and explained things to us patiently over and over and over again. And while I have your attention, there are 175 days until November 5th. We are covering the road to the White House on The Big Deal with Errol Lewis. That's my new show that's on Fridays at 8 p.m. Let's begin. We're going to be done. Those of you who are keeping an eye on what's happening in Madison Square Garden, we will get you done in time to watch the Knicks triumph again tonight at 8 p.m. Let me introduce you to our panel. You saw pictures of these fine folks. Marianne Crotty was the first woman to serve as the state's Director of State Operations and was appointed by Governor Mario Cuomo. The position involved, yes. She managed operations of all state agencies, developed policies, established priorities for the governor's annual State of the State message, and also served as Deputy Secretary for Transportation. And through the years, she has held a series of leadership positions in the public and private sector, and we were thrilled that she was able to join us tonight. Dennis Hamill is a journalist, a novelist, a screenwriter, a TV writer. As a journalist, he served his apprenticeship at the old Flatbush Life Weekly newspaper. He also did time at the Village Voice, wrote columns for New York Magazine, the Los Angeles Herald Examiner, the Boston Herald American, New York Newsday, and the New York Daily News, which is where most of you know him from, I believe. Most recently, he's been writing for the long-running NBC hit TV series Law & Order SVU. And of course, his late brother, Pete Hamill, was instrumental in persuading Mario Cuomo to enter politics. Last but not least, a man who was too modest to introduce himself, Harold Holzer is the Jonathan F. Fanton Director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute here. He was Mario Cuomo's press secretary in 2 phases of that long 1977 mayoral campaign. We're going to hear about that. And Harold was also vice president of the State Urban Development Corporation. He accompanied the governor as a press aide on his 1991 trip to Japan, little-known trip that we're going to hear about. And he co-authored 2 books with Mario Cuomo, Why Lincoln Matters and Lincoln on Democracy. His most recent book is Brought Forth on This Continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration. And he was extremely gracious, gave us a bit of a tour of this fine institution. He's doing amazing work and has helped those of us who are sort of journeymen in all of this, trying to understand politics that was in full swing as we were reaching adulthood. So thank you for all of your help as well. So let's start. I want to ask you, in fact, Harold and Dennis, to I guess talk a little bit about. We know the backstory of Mario Cuomo, born in 1932, raised in Jamaica, Queens. Parents own a grocery store. Excels in school. Graduates at the top of his class in law school. Can't get work due to prejudice against Italians at the time. But handles a racially charged housing conflict that brings him into the public sphere. And there are some journalists, like Pete Hamill, who start nagging at him and urging him to get into politics, which he does at age 42, which is a little unusual.
Yeah, well, it goes back to Pete and Jimmy Breslin. And Pete and Jimmy had this kind of unofficial pact where Jimmy had Queens and Pete had Brooklyn. Yeah. But Mario was in Queens, dealing with that situation in Corona, and Breslin got very excited about this new guy who was the son of immigrants who owned a deli kind of grocery store in Jamaica. Who was a common man who did good. And it was like when you come out of a neighborhood like that in the outer boroughs where you excel, you come from meager roots, from hard work, and you excel, and then you don't forget where you come from, then you become a neighborhood hero. If you think who you are and you don't come back, you're a different kind of, person. But anyway, Mario didn't forget where he came from, and so he mediated that thing in Corona, and it got Jimmy and Pete both very excited that they had, the son of an immigrant, a real New Yorker who looked like a New Yorker, big and brawny, and he had language, and he had guts, and he had compassion, and he understood the nature of the city. He was from the city. He knew that the city were the people that came into the store and bought eggs and bought things and wanted to get whatever was on sale. He understood the common person. And so he was the right guy to do that kind of a thing. And Jimmy and Pete, and then I was lucky enough to start freelancing for the Village Voice, and Jack Newfield hired me over to the Village Voice. And Newfield, Pete, and Jimmy together were very instrumental in urging Mario to run for mayor. They wanted him to be. He was the kind of guy they wanted, that understood the common person in New York, but also had language and intellect and didn't forget where he came from.
Harold, I've been writing columns for many, many years, and I can't get anybody to do anything. I urge people to run or not run or simply tell the truth or try this policy or that policy. We're talking about a sort of a different era, actually.
We're also talking about someone who did not come out of clubhouse politics and instinctively didn't need it, intellectually didn't, emotionally didn't need it, but had an astonishing service ethic. And Dennis is right. The combination of neighborhood eloquence, brilliant eloquence. I mean, it was not just on making speeches. It was in a room where he was negotiating with not only Corona, but Forest Hills, which was the immediate propulsive, extraordinary negotiating that he did that really propelled him. And it was a moment when, remember, it was the tail end of the worst phase of the New York fiscal crisis. And there was a sense that something had to change, that we needed a mayor who could defend us in Albany, although the governor had been good, in terms of rescue, but could make a case for New York's independence going forward, who could reassure the people. So it was that combination that made him irresistible. And also the kind of lack of ambition in a funny way. I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, he didn't need it. He was happy to serve in any way that he could be of service. And then it just took off. The idea that the mayoralty was the right move. I mean, there was the LG race first, but we're not even getting into that.
And how did he convince you to become his press secretary? Was that the first time you'd done anything like that?
No. I was Bella Abzug's press secretary when she ran for the Senate and when she ran for mayor. And I was there at Cooper Union for the big debate, and someone took a pie, ran down the aisle and threw a pie toward Mayor Beam and Bella. Beam ducked and Bella went like this. It's true. It's not on tape. Mario leaped off the stage as the pie was in the air. I will swear forever, they crisscrossed. And the stage at Cooper Union is very high. And he landed on the guy and just destroyed him. And I thought, I know I work for Bella, and she's a feminist icon, and I believe in feminism, but this guy was really impressive, athletically. So when Bella lost, she came in third, or fourth, I think, actually, in the first round. I got a call that Mario wanted to see me. I had actually had a fight with him in an elevator, but it's too complicated. I went out to his house, and with a bunch of people he was considering for the runoff, and he took me to a room alone, and we talked, and he asked me to be his press secretary. I didn't know he asked 4 other people to be his press secretary, but that was okay. Morty Matz, who I spoke to today, is going to be 100 years old in a few months, and I hope is watching.
And just getting started.
He brought me, he's just still has clients, brought me out, and so it was my second mayoral, and of course we ran in a runoff, which was not successful, and a general election campaign.
Right.
So it was a great 4 months.
Right,
Lean and mean, but we did pretty well.
And Dennis, you were on that campaign covering it, right?
Yeah, I was. I just want to say that the guy didn't throw the pie low enough to hit Beam. That's what it but and also, the other thing that you were saying, Errol, was that it was a different era for newspaper columnists back in the day. Had a whole lot more power because the newspapers had power. They were bigger circulation. It was a different kind of era and I guess that's the kind of push that that really helped Cuomo get into the race, I think. And I worked for a paper out in Flatbush, but then when I went to the Village Voice, one of the first assignments I got was to cover the mayoralty race, and I followed Mario around, and he was in Bensonhurst, where I thought he was most impressive, and it was an Italian-American neighborhood. It was on 86th Street under the L out there. And Koch had made the death penalty one of the major issues of the campaign. And I had done a story before that about how he was distributing campaign literature about the death penalty in conservative neighborhoods, but not in liberal neighborhoods. Not in Brooklyn Heights, but in Bay Ridge he would, I mean, so it would, and when I called him out on it, his campaign manager, David Goth, I guess it was his name, freaked out. But anyway, we were out on the campaign trail, and there was one of these guys under the L who came up, and he was out at Gold's Gym, one of those guys with a Marvel comic kind of body, with tuft of hair coming out of the top of his sweatshirt, T-shirt. And he was saying, Mario, how could you not be for the death penalty? And he went over to him, and he grabbed him by a tuft of the hair under his shirt and said, if somebody commits a murder in this town under my watch, he'll go to the can for life. Is that good enough for you? Well, yeah, Mario, that sounds good. He had that kind of a touch. And I was so impressed with it that because Mario was big, just like the guy, and he had the big, thick fingers, but he had this connection, this warmth, and he could speak. The guy knew he was speaking to someone that understood him. And even though they disagreed on the issue, they could find common ground right there on the street corner with the trains running overhead. And it was like a perfect kind of urban image of this guy. He was the perfect guy to be the mayor of New York, I thought, when we were following him around. I had followed Koch around, and I had an argument with Koch about the death penalty. And I said, what about falsely, executed people like Sacco and Vanzetti, for example? He said, I think they were guilty. I said, oh. I said, all right, whatever you think.
That's very
and I
good
quoted
cuss.
him, and he got pissed off. You swear that was off the rack. That was Ed, But it was a great campaign because these two guys, they were real New Yorkers. I mean, Ed was another different kind of a New Yorker than Mario, but he was dyed in the wool in New York City. And it was just a fun one to cover. But
I love the metaphor of the Cooper Union, where Abraham Lincoln has spoken, Mario Cuomo diving off the stage while
Yeah.
people are throwing
Yes.
pies. What I
That's
mean?
right.
Like that's. Well, I want to move on to Mario Cuomo as elected governor. I want to bring in Marianne Crotty and talk a little bit about his hiring style as he's assembling the team and bringing in some or making some unorthodox choices, I guess you could say.
Well, I met Mario way after these guys. He was already governor, and I went in to have an interview, and it was a horrible interview. I mean, really horrible. Like, we fought the whole time. I was like, there's no way I'm getting this job. I'm a fairly easygoing person. I've always had good. We fought about public authorities. Were they protecting the politician, or was the politician, really getting away with things because they were public? And the argument went on forever, and I was like, forget this job. Hopefully they'll keep me back in the assembly. So and then we started to have a much more reasonable kind of conversation about, what elected people do and what are they doing in the office. But I went out of the office and I said to Hank DeLay, was my boss at the time, I said, there's no way I'm getting this job, just so you know. And he said to me, well, why? I said, because there's no way that this guy's going to hire me. We have fundamentally disagreements on public authorities, which is a big part of the transportation job. And Hank says, did you hold your own? Did you keep up your point of view? And I said, yeah, I kept my point of view. He said, well, then you're going to get hired because Mario likes people that will keep their point of view. And fighting him, it's like being a lawyer in court. You fight him as much as you can, and you don't give up. If you changed your mind and said, oh yeah, you're probably right, blah blah blah, you wouldn't get the job. But I'm pretty sure you can get the job. And the next day, I did get the job. So obviously, but that was the whole history of our relationship. Whether it was state agencies, we We had people, we had NCON people who were arresting DOT people for painting the bridge with lead. And you'd just come up with what your solution would be. And many times he would totally disagree. And then he'd come in the morning, kind of think about it overnight, and it would be okay. This is pre-email. I don't know what working for Mario would have been like if there was email. But we used to take memos for the day over to the trooper, and the trooper would give them to Mario, and it'd be back the next morning telling you exactly everything he thought, other questions that were going on. So he did have it wasn't your usual group of people. Everybody had a different perspective, and it was always a really good perspective, because I remember sitting in the room many times and thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of it that way. We had people that were representing the regions, we had people that were representing the agencies. Everybody had their own perspective. And doing the State of the State was one of them that I will hold dear till the day I pass. And even when I was working for the engineering firm afterwards, there was never a politician I couldn't take on. And I give Mario Cuomo that.
He didn't want yes men, I guess.
He didn't want any yes.
You know, our version of email was the pouch. If we were working in New York City, remember the pouch? We would write a memo. It would get to him in the morning, and so within 20 hours, we'd have a handwritten reply back. So that was our system.
Yep.
And was the idea, Marianne, that he wanted debate just to make sure he had fleshed out different ideas, or was he really sort of taking in new information as you all would
I
battle
think he was
these?
taking in new information. And he made sure he was asking all the spokes on the wheel what their perspective was, because he wanted to know what the perspective was from the people that were working in the field on the item, in addition to what was the perspective of the policy geeks that were thinking these things through. He wanted to know what everybody's perspective was, and he took that all into consideration before he came up with his decision.
One of the really striking things, and I hadn't fully recognized it until we sort of put this together and started talking about it, is he gets elected in 1982. No sooner has he gotten there and assembled his cabinet and starts tackling these different issues than he becomes a national figure. And I want to play a little bit of from the famous 1984 speech that he gave at the Democratic National Convention and get your reaction to it. Let's take a look.
10 days ago, President Reagan admitted that although some people in this country seem to be doing well nowadays, others were unhappy, even worried about themselves, their families, and their futures. The president said that he didn't understand that fear. He said, "Why, this country is a shining city on a hill." And the president is right. In many ways, we are a shining city on a hill. But the hard truth is that not everyone is sharing in this city's splendor and glory. A shining city is perhaps all the president sees from the portico of the White House and the veranda of his ranch, where everyone seems to be doing well. But there's another city. There's another part to the shining city. The part where some people can't pay their mortgages, and most young people can't afford one, where students can't afford the education they need, and middle-class parents watch the dreams they hold for their children evaporate. In this part of the city, there are more poor than ever, more families in trouble, more and more people who need help but can't find it. Even worse, there are elderly people who tremble in the basements of the houses there. And there are people who sleep in the city's streets, in the gutter, where the glitter doesn't show. There are ghettos where thousands of young people without a job or an education give their lives away to drug dealers every day. There is despair, Mr. President, in the faces that you don't see, in the places that you don't visit, in your shining city. In fact, Mr. President, this is a nation Mr. President, you ought to know that this nation is more a tale of two cities than it is just a shining city on a hill.
Okay. So this is, this is 1984. This is the re-election bid for Ronald Reagan, who won New York in 1980 and in 1984. This positions Mario Cuomo in a very particular place as far as the Democratic response to the Reagan Revolution.
Whenever I hear that, I remember his reading it to me before he left for the West Coast. He used to read speeches to certain people in advance, and I didn't know he was going to use the construct of speaking directly to Reagan. And my brilliant comment was, "Do you really think you ought to speak directly to Reagan?" He said, "Yes." So, yeah, great keynote addresses, which are very rare, far between, propel people, if they're successful, into national consideration, as it did with Barack Obama. And Bill Clinton kind of survived a terrible keynote address. But yeah, there was speculation about him almost immediately after that speech. One of the great speeches in the 20th century, I think.
And Marianne, what was the reaction like back in Albany? I mean, he's just sort of achieving liftoff with regard to New York issues, and now here he is on the national stage.
The reaction, I think, was overall positive, and it goes back to, I think one of his great lines in one of his books was that basically the politics is the poetry and the government is the prose. And that's what kind of we all thought. Okay, so we're going to say this. How do we turn this into prose that kind of match up to it? So I think it was general impressive, and most of the staff at that point were like, "Wow, this guy's really going to be a contender. He's like one of the great Democratic properties in the entire country, and he's really going to take off on that." I think that was the overall response.
And people were or were not thinking, "Hey, we're all going to Washington."
I suspect there was a group of people that thought they were going to Washington. Most of them were just like, "We're going to have to stay home and handle all this while he's running off doing this."
I'm glad Marianne mentioned the poetry and prose thing. He also did not like to talk about the speech after the speech, at least to me. He said, "I suffer from," this is going to sound sexist, this is the 80s. He said, "I suffer from dumb blonde theory." I said, "What's dumb blonde theory?" He said, "People come up to, it's like a beautiful blonde woman. No one ever takes her seriously. People come up to me and say, 'You have such a beautiful voice. You speak so beautifully.' And I say, 'What did I say?' And they say, 'I don't know, but you said it so beautifully. I love to hear you.'" He was concerned about that. It's like the prose and the poetry. He knew we reveled in the cadence and the timbre of his voice, which was a marvelous instrument. You couldn't help but just fall in love with the sound. But there was a lot of substance there, and he wanted us to get that as well.
And New Yorkers still loved it during the Reagan years, didn't they? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they could still differentiate between the national politics and the local, and elect a Mario Cuomo at the same time that they might be splitting the ticket for.
Right. It
Ronald
did him
Reagan.
no harm that Reagan won New York
Yeah.
State.
Right.
Let's look at another important speech that came really shortly after this, where he goes to Notre Dame to talk about abortion.
Now, as a Catholic, I have accepted certain answers as the right ones for myself and for my family. And because I have, they have influenced me in special ways, as Matilda's husband, as a father of 5 children, as a son who stood next to his own father's deathbed, trying to decide if the tubes and the needles no longer served a purpose. As a governor, however, I'm involved in defining policies that determine other people's rights in these same areas of life and death. Abortion is one of these issues, and while it is only one issue among many, it is one of the most controversial and affects me in a special way as a Catholic public official.
You don't hear that kind of thing, Dennis, very much anymore.
It's amazing that all these years later that this is still a major issue and that we've, revoked all the freedoms that were won back then. It's amazing to me. And he was a guy that had to wrestle with that with his religion. I mean, it was hard to articulate. No one could articulate it any better than that. But he managed to do that and not lose Catholic votes, at the same time. He knew how to do, a separation of religion and state.
And Marianne, was there division on the staff about him sort of cutting the issue in this particular way?
I think that there was some division, but most of all, I believe people thought, well, he really came up with a sensible way to approach this. Like the Notre Dame speech really was able to explain to everybody how you could be a Catholic politician and still support a woman's right to choose. I don't hear anybody talking at that intellectual level about that anymore. I mean, they may say it's states' rights or it shouldn't be a Supreme Court, but they really don't come to terms with what was really in his head at that point.
On the plane out there, the engine on the old tub that he drove,
B1,
it I don't know if it was in World War I, but maybe World War II. It started to smoke on the way to Notre Dame, and the press corps was hysterical. What did we do? We're just accompanying him. And he turned to the press people and said, "Aren't you in a state of grace?" And a few weeks after, I don't whether it was the next year or the next month, I was walking with him in a I don't know, St. Patrick's Day or Columbus Day parade up Fifth Avenue, and as there was a moment when the governor pauses at St. Patrick's and goes up the steps and shakes the hand of the cardinal. And as the governor got to the steps, the cardinal went inside the church and closed the door, like Martin Luther. And he said, "Don't worry about it. We just keep going." It was a terrible moment for him. I still remember how he didn't show it, but I know it hurt him very deeply. And he thought it was unfair to not separate church and state.
You know what? I wanted to ask you, Harold, about a trip to Japan that somehow escaped us as we were putting all of this together.
It's because I got such great press out there. No one knew that we were there.
Well, I mean, first of all, it was rare for him to not end up back in Albany, right? I mean, that was the thing, is he didn't
That's a tough overnight. Tokyo. It was going to be a few days.
What was the purpose of the trip? What was that all
It was
about?
an economic development trip, which is why I was assigned to it. We were going to meet the Keidan Ren. We were going to meet the head of Toyota and Honda and get business for New York State if we could. And en route, actually, we all went up to his seat, and he said, I don't want this to be about presidential speculation. It's 1991, late 91. And this is what I'm going to say. If someone asks me, are you going to run for president? I'm going to say, I have no plans and no plans to make plans. Do you like it? I said, yeah, it sounds great. He said, well, you say it too. I have no plans. So we all repeated it. And every time, there were journalists all over the place, international journalists. And they all said, at every stop, Governor, you're going to run for president. I have no plans, and I have no plans to make plans, over and over. The last night, we had a reception at the Imperial Hotel, and a young AP reporter came up and said, Governor, are you going to run for president? And he said, well, if you would have told me that in my first 2 days here there would have been a typhoon and an earthquake, I would have said it was impossible. And then he walked away. What are we supposed to do? He's off script. So the journalist turns to me and says, what does that mean? And I said, I guess it means anything is possible. The next day, the New York Times ran a story that said, Cuomo aide on presidency, anything is possible. And he used to come into my room every morning in his bathrobe to get the clips that were faxed from New York. And I saw it first, and I said, oh my God, I'm going to have to relocate to Tokyo, never go back. And his press secretary, Gary Fryer, called me and said, what the hell have you done? What did you do? I said, I didn't do anything. Anyway, he came in, he looked at this, took the story out of the fax machine, and he said, not bad. So that was the story of Tokyo. in relation to the
Not bad.
1992. Not bad.
Interesting, not bad. Okay. Well, we do have this this building expectation as 1992 rolls around that something could happen, right? And there's a lot of drama. We'll, I guess, have to parse it because it all came down to one day and really a few hours within that one day. But why don't we play the clip of him making a decision and then kind of get a where were you on that day?
It's my responsibility as governor to deal with this extraordinarily severe problem. Were it not, I would travel to New Hampshire today and file my name as a candidate in its presidential primary. That was my hope, and I prepared for it. But it seems to me I cannot turn my attention to New Hampshire while this threat hangs over the head of the New Yorkers that I've sworn to put first.
Now, Marianne, this was December 20th, 1991, literally the 11th hour, literally the last minute, 2 planes idling on the tarmac, 2 speeches written, which way is he going to go, and that sort of a thing. We heard from at least some of the senior staff that they found out at the same time as the rest of the world what he was going to do. Were you surprised one way or the other about how all of this worked out?
No, I don't think I was surprised at how it worked out. There were certainly camps on the floor that were hoping for the other way, and we're going to, go to Washington and be famous and all that. But I don't think I was that surprised because, first of all, I don't think the governor liked all that travel. You talked about him not staying overnight. He didn't like to really stay overnight. He came back from very long trips, and I don't think he really liked that. Also, we were in the middle of budget debate, the state of the state. There were things going on in New York that would have really been affected by him deciding to run. So even though there were a lot of people that this would be great, he's going to run for president, we're going to be very famous, I think there were also a lot of people thinking this is going to be a really major change in everybody's life, and trying to figure out what the Senate and the Assembly and what the Republicans were going to do to him was really kind of horrible. So I don't think I was surprised. I don't think I would have guessed it, but I don't think it was a shock.
It's interesting, as I think of subsequent governors who have tried to make the run, if they had a hostile, recalcitrant, or otherwise problematic situation in their state capital, it really is actually pretty tough. It's not like, we've seen governors who had a compliant, sort of same party, docile legislature that actually helps them along. I think that's what we just saw in Florida, frankly. On the other hand, that wasn't the situation in Albany that particular year.
It wasn't. The Republicans controlled the Senate, and the Democrats controlled the Assembly. So it was not going to be easy, whatever. And the Republicans were certainly going to cause a lot of problems for him with the budget and getting the legislative stuff done if he had decided that he was going to take off and, be in New Hampshire and Iowa and wherever else he was going to go.
And Dennis, I mean, these these columnists who had dragged him into public life in the first place, do they take any responsibility for where and how all of this ended up?
With him not running?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they were as baffled as everyone else, and they looked at the possibility that he was afraid that people were going to accuse him of having mob ties or something like that, like Geraldine Ferraro's family was tainted with that. And but nobody that I knew or that they knew, that I know that Pete and Jimmy talked about, and guys like Nick Pileggi, really looked deeply into it, and there was nothing.
At his
there was
invitation.
Yeah.
At Mario's invitation.
Right, was it? Yeah. I mean, there was no there. I mean, if there were mob ties, Nick Pileggi would find it. I mean, believe me. I mean, he's the guy that wrote Wise Guys in Casino, but he sat across from me at New York Magazine. He was one of the best reporters that I've ever worked with. He was thorough. All the young reporters used his files long before there was Google. You went to Pileggi's house. As long as you put everything back the way you found it, it was okay. Same with Barrett, I guess. But Pileggi really, when he put his name on something, it was pretty much gospel. The rest of us believed it. I don't think that it was that. I just think he just didn't want to go to Washington.
And you were watching and waiting that day along with the rest of us.
I kind of knew early because I got the call at 6 a.m. and I actually heard the announcement speech. I don't know how many people got, well, I do know one other person who got to hear it. And I said, Governor, that is the greatest announcement speech I've ever heard. And he said, now I'm going to read you the speech I'm more likely to make. He actually wrote both speeches, so I don't think he decided until, and I think Marianne is right. He had an overweening sense of responsibility to the state, and the state was in, politically motivated fiscal crisis, and he did not. I don't think he didn't go because he thought that people would be carping at him for leaving. I think he didn't go because he thought it would be the wrong thing to do, and. I'm just putting on my historian's hat. I think he would have been a great American president. And it is since our tragedy that he wasn't able to do it. But they were both great speeches. He did read it to one guy who hung up before the next line, and he called another fabled political reporter named Marsha Kramer and said, he's in. So Channel 2 was on record saying he's about to announce for president.
Ooh, we've all been there. Oh,
Yeah.
That's a tough one. I want folks to join us, get your thoughts together, and we'll circulate some mics and take some questions from the audience. I wanted to, Marianne, talk about one last bit of wistfulness where having passed up a chance to run for president, the guy who did win, Bill Clinton, was rumored, and I guess floating the idea of appointing Mario Cuomo to the U.S. Supreme Court. And there again, he was very thoughtful and deliberative about whether or not he was going to do it, right?
First of all, he didn't want to take the president's call. He didn't want to talk about the decision, which I always thought was hysterical, because I actually thought the Supreme Court was a better fit for him. You go to Washington, you're intellectual, you're looking at complicated legal issues, which is something that he always wanted to do. So I always felt that was, that's not like you have to go to New Hampshire and Iowa and Kansas. That's like you're going to Washington. You can do that. So I was kind of surprised, but that's just not what he wanted to do at that point.
I'm
That's,
trying to imagine a sitting governor not taking a call from the White House.
I know. I thought it was kind of like, well, you have to take the president's call. Why?
Right. Why bother, right? What do you think of that, Dennis?
I don't know. I think he probably would have been a great Supreme Court justice. I think we got Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She wasn't so bad. Although I wish she would have stepped down a little earlier. That's for sure. But I think it would have been a great fit for him. But I think he, as someone pointed out in the podcast, he really loved being the governor. He liked being an executive. I don't think he wanted to sit around with 8 other mummies, sitting, in black robes and saying this is going to be the rest of my life. I think he had other stuff he wanted to do. I think.
Interesting. Okay. Let's take a few questions.
Hello, I'm Steven Schlesinger. I was in the picture up there. I started out as a speechwriter for Mario, and he knew that I was interested in global affairs, so he gradually, as the years passed, started giving me more and more stuff related to international issues. But he always would tell me, he said, I don't feel comfortable with foreign affairs. I don't understand it. I understand everything about New York State, but I just don't really get what goes on abroad. And I said, well, foreign policy, it's like local politics. You get the deal in any country when you find out what the local issues are, and that's the way you grab it. But he never really felt comfortable. I went to the trip to Russia with him in 1978, 77, I guess it was.
87.
87, I mean. And he had I always felt that he wasn't quite sure why he was there in many ways, because he knew he thought it was important to educate himself. But during the trip, and he met with Sakharov, so he really was very interested in that the dissident community. But when he came back, he didn't really follow up very much on that. And at one point, Kerry Kennedy, was then engaged to Andrew, wanted to get him interested in the Polisario movement in Algeria, which was an attempt to preserve part of Morocco for this particular tribal group. And we had a meeting with the emissary from Polisario, and he did it dutifully, and we had the meeting, and then he never talked about it to me again. They stayed in touch with me, in fact, invited me over, which I did. I took the trip over to Morocco to represent the governor. But that was the end of it. We never talked foreign policy after that. So I think that may be one of the issues that...
Right.
Can I just comment on what Stephen says? He was very interested in the solidarity movement in Poland. And out of those meetings came the Lincoln on Democracy book. It was created for the Polish teachers who came to see him and said, our libraries are open. What should we have to teach our students that has been repressed? And the governor said Lincoln. And but we can't get it. So he called up and said, let's do it. And that's how it happened. It was originally a Polish edition, and then it became an English
It's interesting.
language
I
edition.
never think of it as that far of a stretch, since we are on the Canadian border, and
Right.
we share some bridges and some territorial waters, and you've got the Mohawk Nation and other, I mean, it's not completely out of the realm of what a governor has to deal with.
No,
right?
and I think he did deal with it. But Stephen was dealing with it, so he was an advisor, right? He had you, he had a few other people.
Okay, let's speak with this person in the red. This lady. And
Trudy
then-
Mason.
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
How are you?
Okay, we haven't seen each other
lot of
for a
friends
while.
here, yeah, it's good to see you.
I guess I'm short. The story I'm going to tell is about tall Mario and short Trudy. Mario did get involved in the presidential campaign of 1984, and he ran New York State with Sandy Frusher, who some of you will remember also. And I had the great honor of being the New York State press secretary. And we used to have the conferences right at the headquarters, and we were walking out of the back room, and I knew him, he knew me by then, but suddenly he looked at me and he said, "Wait, stop." And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "You're short." And I'm tall. At which point he got down, and Don Pollard should be sitting here because he took this wonderful picture. Mario got down in kind of a squatting position, and as we walked out of the back room to all of these reporters assembled, he said, "Now you shouldn't feel so short, because here I am with you." And I don't remember what the press conference was about. We had some, but he made some, he really didn't, with all due respect, Harold, he was his own best secretary, and I'm saying that about me and whatever. He knew how to handle the press better than anybody else I had ever since then or worked with or anything. He was just marvelous. And Dennis, I think you'll agree that reporters really loved him. And they loved to work with him. So it was one of the easier press secretary jobs. But I will always tell people that, and I wish I had brought the picture, because he decided I couldn't get taller, but he could get shorter.
He did respond to reporters. I did a column one time about a kid that was in a street altercation, and the two kids were dueling with cardboard in tubes, the kind that you get inside a wallpaper or something. And one of the kids inadvertently hit another guy that was passing by who happened to be a prison guard in the head, and that guy had the kid arrested. And the DA wanted the kid to take a plea, and he refused. And because he went to trial and blew trial, there was mandatory sentencing of 2 years. The kid had to do 2 years, no criminal record. And I wrote a column saying, "Dear Mario Cuomo," about this kid. And he responded the same day. I mean, it was like early in the morning, and he said, "I'm going to do whatever I can for him. I can't pardon him, but he's not going into general population. I'm going to get him into a halfway house as fast as he's going to get him home to his parents as soon as humanly possible." And he did. I mean, he did everything he could to get the kid out. He did respond. If you brought things to his attention, there was a humanity to him that you just didn't get from an awful lot of politicians.
I got more from the son than from the father, but I know he was also not averse to calling you up, right? He wouldn't necessarily wait for the column, right?
Yeah.
Is this, I can't see behind the mic, behind the mask. Is this Michael? That is Michael Myers. Hi.
Thank you. I'm Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. All this adulation is very good. However, the Mario Cuomo I remember, and just like the Ed Koch I remember, they were not good on housing integration and school integration. So I want the panel to discuss the drawbacks, the negatives about Mario Cuomo and Ed Koch, but mostly Mario Cuomo in terms of the failure to promote housing integration and school integration.
Okay,
They were great liberals.
We'll let Ed off the hook because this is not about him tonight. But
I'm kind of stumped on that. What was it about Mario that you thought?
you talking about Forest Hills? Or you talking about you're talking about Forest Hills.
No, well, Forest Hills, he wrote an entire book about it, and and it was one of the things that propelled him. I thought it was, again, one of those situations where he went into a neighborhood and tried to find some kind of consensus. There was such adversity to building those public houses in Forest Hills that it was, Queens is a funny place. There's still people in Queens who haven't forgiven Lindsay for snowfalls, But because I live out in Queens, so I think for a guy from Corona to go to Forest Hills and try to get some kind of a compromise out of the neighborhood was more than anybody else that was in government was going to accomplish. Did he do enough? I think he did as much, as he could at the time. What would you propose that he do more of? No.
Yeah,
Whatever.
I think Forest Hills was as much as could be gotten, and nothing would have happened had not Mario been able to get concessions and cooperation from both of those seemingly intractable communities there.
Right.
And yes, he added senior housing as a palliative, I guess. But Michael, I don't know where you're coming from on school integration. Mario was a good education governor, as far as I remember.
Well, I've written some about some of these issues, and I think, look, you fast forward 40 years, transit-oriented development was something that Governor Hochul put forward, and the suburban legislators, including many Democrats, were ready to burn down the State House, right? So we're a generation later, and a lot of the same issues. Totally agree with you. Yes.
Here's your mic.
So my name is Rose Rodriguez. I was only 31 years old when Mario Cuomo called me. I was working for the Board of Education at the time, and he said, I want you to come work for me. And it took me by surprise, and he says, you're going to get a call from Al Gordon, pay attention, and join the team. So now I joined him, and I was hoping that he would run for president. I went to work for him in 1993. My first day on the job was the 1993 World Trade Center. Wow. I was on the 57th floor.
Wow.
So that was, I said to him one day, I started the job with a bang, and he was like, wow. But my question is, because what happened when he decided not to run for president, which I was excited about, the Bill Clinton people had approached me so that I could be part of their team, and I was sitting that out because I was sure that Mario Cuomo was going to do this. And I was the one that I was listening in when he was reaching the airport and never made it. But anyway, as a result of him not running for president, he ended up running again for re-election. And who turned out to be his co-campaign manager, working with John Marino? Myself and Bill Lynch. We were the two co-campaign managers of that race. The question that I have, because of my experience in that race, that I could get into details some other time, but my question was, if you can help me, what was the sentiment of the administration when he decided at least to run for a fourth term? Because in that race, there was a sense when I was trying to reach folks in the administration to just join in on the campaign, which was deep and intense with what we were going through with the death penalty and crime and all of that, and me driving all over the city. And on that election day, what I felt afterwards was, were they present? Did they believe that he could win, or did they think that he was going to win?
I mean, I was out of the administration by then, but I stayed in pretty close weekend contact. Yeah, I think he thought he would win. I think something very strange happened in that campaign. When my own view is that when the campaign took Rudy Giuliani upstate, although it was a coup downstate that a Republican mayor had endorsed a Democratic governor, the effect upstate, where they toured extensively, was that, oh, this is going to be an all downstate administration. And I think that's what did it. It's very hard. Fourth terms are very hard. Franklin Roosevelt nearly lost his fourth term. Had he not endured a 10-hour rain-soaked campaign swing through Manhattan and Brooklyn, at the end, he might have lost to Dewey. And, the fourth term didn't work for Koch. I mean, it doesn't work.
Right.
Usually.
I mean, other than Rockefeller, who
Except for Rockefeller.
had extraordinary resources at his command. We got time for two more. So you, sir,
and Michael,
sir, and in the back.
I want to ask about the very ugly campaign against Koch. How much do you think Mario knew about or took part in the homophobic slurs against Koch? And what was the backstory of that? Was that Andrew? I mean, where did that all come from?
So, Ralph, I was there. There was never a vote for Cuomo, not the homo sign that anyone ever saw. Or the New York Historical Society would have 5 copies in its archives. I don't know how that urban myth ever got started, but I will go to my demise denying that that ever happened. I was in the campaign. And he held a press conference with Marie LaGuardia. Okay? I told him 2 pieces of advice. Don't put on Fiorello's hat. I begged him not to put on the hat. He put on the hat. He said, I know why you don't want me to put on the hat. You think I'll look like a gangster. I said, well, just don't put on the hat. New York Post, big picture of, and I said, maybe we shouldn't mention this issue that's come up because don't dignify it. And he did. He talked about it. He said it's not true, and go back to the transcripts of those events. I never saw a sign. Andrew Cuomo never saw a sign, much less created a sign. If some idiot walked by with a magic marker, as we called them, and put it on a piece of oak tag, as we called it, I don't think that's the responsibility of the campaign.
Long before Twitter, that went viral, though, that slogan.
Yeah. I've never, yes, sir, and then I'm going to have to also, no, please.
I'm Michael Kramer. I wanted to talk a little bit about the other campaign that didn't happen, when Mario didn't run in 1988. Does anybody remember that? There was, Ethan remembers it, sure. There was a tremendous amount of anticipation, expectation that he would run for the Democratic nomination and that he would have it. I took off 6 months between New York Magazine and Time Magazine to do a book with him about this, about his presidential run, which obviously didn't happen. The book died too. But I wanted to tell you a little anecdote that kind of supports what Steve Schlesinger was talking about when he talked about Mario not being particularly interested in foreign affairs. On February 12th, 1987, we were in Los Angeles. Mario had been asked by Mickey Cantor and a bunch of other California Democrats to come and speak. There were 1,000. Remember that, Ethan? There were about right. Stanley Scheinbaum was the Democratic Party chairman of California. And Mario called and asked, what do you want me to talk about? I can give you the Ellis Island speech, which was shorthand for, son of immigrants, the whole bit. I can do some issues, I can do some other things. And Scheinbaum conferred with Cantor, said, oh, Ellis Island, that's great. Mario gives this speech and universally condemned for it. The next morning, we were coming back, as Marianne knows. I mean, he hated staying over in Los Angeles, didn't understand why he had to. We're in the car going to the airport. I'm looking at the front page of the LA Times. It's February 13th, 1987. And in that article, which was huge, everybody, including Mickey Cantor, Stanley Scheinbaum, a bunch of other prominent California Democrats, said that he had bombed, that they wanted him to give, a substantive speech, and that he had completely blown it. And I'm reading this thing, and Mario says, "What does it say?" And I said, "Oh, nothing." And he reaches across, and with his hand was, how big it was, right? Grabs the thing out of my hand, reads the article, crumples it up, throws it on the floor. Doesn't say another word. A couple of days later, we're in New Orleans at Tulane, where he gives a fabulous policy-driven speech. Comes off the stage, says to me, "Okay, I showed them, now I don't have to do this." And I didn't quite know what he was talking about. But I do know that right before that speech, when he was studying these issues and studying foreign policy issues, because he was gearing up to do this, to run in '88, he said to me, this is almost a paraphrase, "Do you remember when Jerry didn't know the difference between first use and first strike?" There was a nuclear warfighting doctrine about first use and first strike. Jerry was Geraldine Ferraro, Mondale's running mate, and she had been caught out because she didn't know this. And I said, yeah, I remember it. He said, "You have to know these things." And he went back to reading a policy brief on farm policy. And he said, we were the only two people in this hotel room, and he said, "Do you know about price supports and parity?" And I said something like, "I don't know, fucking think about it." And he's, "But you don't have to, you can just kind of vamp your way." He said, no. And a few days later, I'll get back to this in a second, he announces that he's not going to run. He goes to the radio show that night, pulls out this piece of paper. I thought this was all a goof on me and Ethan and Stephen. And in the car, by the way, up to the radio show, Mario says, "Oh God, I better tell Andrew," because Andrew didn't know that he was not running. And his point to me was, and we discussed it further later, is that he had to know his brief 110%. He couldn't perform, he couldn't act, he couldn't be governor unless he knew everything. And he was brilliant, but he needed to know every detail. And he was really scared, in a way, of being caught out, not for mob ties or anything like that, but about being somehow a phony because he didn't know some of these issues. That was a side of him I think many people didn't know, and that was hidden. One other thing about his vindictiveness, which nobody's mentioned here. This guy Scheinbaum, remember him from California? He shows up on the morning of Mario going to the radio show. I come into the office. Mary Tregalia's wonderful secretary says to me, "Do you know why he's canceled all of his appointments today?" And I said, "I don't know." And I go in, and he hands me, this piece of paper that he had written. He said, "No, let me read it to you." It was just like you, Harold. He said, "Let me read to you why I'm not running for president." And I said, "Oh, you're just kidding." And he said, "No, that's how I feel." And around noon, Mary rings in and says, "Stanley Scheinbaum is here." And he said, "Oh, yes, just give me a few minutes." And he turns to me, he said, "Michael, do you have your tape recorder with you?" And I said, yeah, and I give it to him. He takes my tape recorder, puts it under some papers, turns it on, right? In other words, there is a record of this. He says to me, Scheinbaum had spent the last week trying to call and get through to Mario and to tell him, you know, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that in the LA Times, I was misquoted, all this bullshit. And so he had called Scheinbaum and said, if you can come in tomorrow, I have some time in the schedule to talk to you. Scheinbaum takes the red eye, comes into New York. This was down at the Trade Center, not in Albany. And comes in, and Mario says, oh, it's all forgiven. I never, you know, you're still my guy in California, Stanley. Scheinbaum leaves. Mario says to him, when are you going back? He said, I'm taking the 4:30 plane back to LA. He said, when does that get in? Scheinbaum says, 7:30. He said, only 3 hours? And Stanley said, you know, there's a time difference, you know. He said, oh, yeah. And fast forward, he makes the statement. He leaves the radio station. We go to the heliport, going back to Albany, and I said, look, I don't want to, this is too upsetting. I'm not going to come back to Albany tonight. And he starts walking toward the chopper, and he turns around, and he comes back to me, and he says, I don't care how long it takes you or what you have to do. I want to find out what happened with Scheinbaum when he got home. And about a year later, I'm out in LA, I go to dinner with them, and I said, you know, I don't know what happened. And Mrs. Scheinbaum says, oh, I'll tell you what happened. He got off the plane at LAX. This is before there were planes on phones, right? And he calls and he says to me, everything's great, I'm still Mario's guy out here. And she said, I told him, haven't you heard? And I went back to New York, and a few days later, and I went to Mario and I reported what had happened, and he took that big fist and slammed it into his other hand. He said, yes, like that. So there was a part of him that didn't right, Steve, that didn't really accept slights.
We heard a lot of that from some of the alumni, especially the basketball games. I see Mike Klein there. That it could get a little testy under the rim. Look, that brings us to the end of our time. We have a reception for you. I understand there's going to be some wine. We can continue with the stories, but please join me in thanking our great panel: Marianne Crotty, Dennis Hamill, and Harold Holzer. Thank you all so much for being a part of this, and we will see you next time.